Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the fourth webinar in our fall webinar series. Today's event focuses on school climate and integrating social and emotional learning. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website after the event. You can find our past webinars and this one at www.revivingschools.org. This interactive webinar will include some polling questions and a Q&A session at the end of the event. Since everyone is muted, we will primarily use the chat pod to collect questions and answers. During the Q&A, you'll also have the ability to raise your hand and ask a question. I will unmute you, and you can then ask your question when prompted. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and I will now turn it over to Nick to get us started.
Thank you, Jill. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jill said, my name is Nick Yoder, and I'm a technical assistant consultant and researcher at the American Institutes for Research. I spend about half my time working with states, districts, and schools, thinking about and supporting them in their efforts to integrate social and emotional learning and school climate within their schools. And I spend about the other half of my time conducting evaluations of SEL programs. So I really have a nice balance of doing some consulting work and research work. And prior to joining AIR, I was a teacher in Chicago Public Schools and an instructional coach in Detroit, and I taught pre-service teachers in the University of Michigan. I'm excited to be talking with you today about an approach to improve school climate and integrate social and emotional learning as part of the School Turnaround webinar series. I am joined today by Mark Garibaldi. Mark, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Nick. Hi, yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Garibaldi. I'm a researcher at AIR in Health and Social Development. I do spend a great deal of my time evaluating social and emotional learning programs and working with districts and schools on organizational shifts to best optimize their time and an investment in social and emotional learning. I also have a background in education where I was a teacher for 3 years and a behavior therapist for the following 3 years in the school context. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm very excited to move forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. As Jill mentioned, there are chat features on the side of the screen. Although we do have polling questions throughout the presentation, we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, as we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. In case you aren't familiar with the American Institutes for Research, we are a large behavioral and social science research whose mission is to help solve the most critical challenges in education, health, workforce, and international development. We have four objectives with the overall goal to inform you about the SEL and school climate implementation path. Our 4 objectives include review school climate, why it's important for students, and practices that support school climate. We're going to do the same thing for social and emotional learning. Review what it is, why it's important, and some teaching practices to promote SEL. Then we want to describe the important connection between SEL and school climate and why we developed a path to really integrate both SEL and school climate. So in our last goal, we're really going to help you understand the pathway for school climate and SEL efforts to implement in schools and districts, and we're going to provide you some concrete tools and resources that you all can use. And I'm going to pass it over to Mark.
Thank you, Nick. So for the first portion of this talk today, as Nick mentioned, we're going to talk about SEL and school climate and then eventually the link between the two. But before we do that, I do want to frame a little bit more about what SEL and school climate is before we actually get into the details. So we're just going to ask a quick polling question as we move forward, just to frame this. And feel free, you should see on your screen now a blue screen. It says quick poll with this question. How much time during the school day should be dedicated to SEL? 5 minutes, 45 minutes, 120 minutes, or most of the day? And so I can't see the results of these yet, but maybe Jill can tell us what the outcomes are after everyone has inputted all of their responses.
And we've got one person that's voted, so let's see if I get anybody else. I'll give a couple more seconds here.
Okay, all right, 45 minutes. All right. Obviously, this is not the most representative sample, but I do appreciate the participation of the one person, or maybe two people who respond. So thank you very much. Well, there are many ways to implement SEL in schools, which I will discuss. But it is important to note that as we dive into this, that there is a common misconception about the importance of SEL that often is reflected in the time dedicated to its implementation. So currently within the school, currently within the school setting, there is a strong focus on the connection between cognitive development and academic performance. However, social and emotional competencies in the classroom instruction are really the cornerstones, so to speak, that support academic performance. In other words, cognitive skills and academic performance would topple without the development of social emotional skills, just as a diamond would fall without the proper support from all angles, as seen in this graphic. So this misconception often manifests in the lack of time dedicated or allotted for SEL in the schools. More broadly, it also affects whether schools can harness the environment to foster a positive school climate that can ultimately bolster the implementation of SEL. So school climate, so there are multiple ways to promote student development of social emotional skills. As I mentioned, one approach includes the promotion of a positive school climate. So school climate refers to the quality and character of a school life. It involves many aspects of a student's educational experience. It is also the product of a school's attention to foster safety and promote a supportive academic, disciplinary, and physical environment. And probably the simplest, but also the most encompassing way of understanding school climate is that it reflects the norms, goals, values, relationships, teaching practices, learning styles, and organizational structures of a school. So now, the research also suggests that school climate is linked to students' academic success, pro-social behaviors, and lifelong success with college and career attainment. So for instance, when a school fosters a positive school climate, its students show an increase in motivation to learn, social emotional adjustment, and academic performance compared with those schools with negative school climates. So a positive school climate also reduces incidence of risk behavior, substance abuse, violence, and rates of absenteeism, suspension, and dropout. So now school climate can be implemented with a responsive learning environment mediated by social emotional learning, so that ultimately bolsters a sense of connectedness and family engagement, as well as instructional practices in school and activities. This is best accomplished when a school focuses on three main elements: engagement, safety, and environment. Engagement refers to the relationships, respect for diversity, and school participation within this context. Safety refers to the actual and perceived emotional and physical safety, as well as substance abuse that may be occurring within the environment. And lastly, environment refers to the physical condition of the actual building, noise levels, hallways, cafeterias, etc., as well as the academic supportive environment from teachers and administrators, as well as the wellness of students and teachers, and disciplinary policies and procedures. So as I mentioned earlier, related to school climate is the mediating influence of SEL. Prior to discussing the relationship between SEL and school climate, it's important that we first get on the same page about the understanding of what SEL is, as it is more widely spoken about amongst practitioners, administrators, policymakers, and of course researchers. SEL is the process of developing the skills, attitudes, behavior, and knowledge that help youth and adults identify and regulate their emotions, develop positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. Although most think that the development of social emotional skills is just for the beginning of the school year or for those who have social emotional concerns, SEL skills are really for everyone and can be applied in places other than school. SEL helps build the foundation for students and adults to succeed in school and develop the skills we need later in life. So as I mentioned, SEL is a process that helps students develop social-emotional skills. CASEL identifies 5 overarching social-emotional competencies as composed of multiple skills. So they're broken down in different sections, and I'm going to unpack this in just a moment. But I just first want to outline here that self-awareness and self-management can really be more closely clustered together. They're considered the more personal or intrapersonal skills, whereas social awareness and relationship skills are also more clustered together, and those are pertaining to the more interpersonal skills. And lastly, responsible decision-making is clustered by itself, and is more thought of as the more cognitive, the social cognitive aspect of these skills. So now I'm going to unpack these a little bit more so we have an understanding of what social-emotional skills actually look like. So self-awareness skills help individuals recognize their own emotions as well as their own feelings, interests, and strengths and limitations. And some of the skills within self-awareness include label and recognize one's own emotions and the emotions of others, identify what triggers one's own emotions, and analyze emotions and how they affect others. So as you can see, many of these skills are needed to be successful in the classroom. For example, it's extremely important for students to recognize what they are good at and what they need help with, so they know where to focus their limited time. Self-management skills help individuals regulate their emotions as well as their behavior in a way that helps them manage the stressors of everyday life. These skills within self-management include setting plans and working towards goals, overcoming obstacles and creating strategies for long-term goals, regulating emotions, and so forth. Similarly, many of these skills are needed in order to be successful with the more rigorous academic standards. With more challenging work, students are more likely to become frustrated in their efforts to solve problems. Needing to know how to regulate their frustration in order to keep on task becomes a crucial part of school. Social awareness helps individuals empathize with others as well as appreciate similarities and differences. Some of these skills within social awareness include identifying social cues to determine how others feel, predict others' feelings and reactions, evaluate others' emotions and emotional reactions. Social awareness is extremely important with many of the new instructional practices required by college and career readiness standards. Students have to participate in more collaborative tasks and actively engage in discussions with their peers. In order to successfully interact with their classmates, they need to recognize how others react to them and react to participation in these activities. So relationship skills help individuals exhibit pro-social behaviors, get along with their peers and adults, and develop meaningful relationships. Some of these specific skills include the ability to demonstrate capacity to make friends, exhibit cooperative learning and working toward group goals, evaluate own skills to communicate with others, and so forth. In combination with social awareness skills, students need relationship skills to participate in the collaborative activities and discussions we mentioned previously. They need to know how to persuasively communicate, and they need to provide support to those students who might be struggling. And lastly, responsible decision-making skills are a manner and consider alternatives to solving problems. They are the way that we are able to solve problems. They are the skills that enable us to identify decisions one makes at school, discuss strategies used to resist peer pressure, and reflect on how current choices affect future outcomes. Responsible decision-making skills help students reflect on their choices in school and help them recognize that their current actions impact what they want in their futures. Now that we have a common understanding about what SEL is, let us turn to why it is important. In a study by Durlak and colleagues, they reviewed 213 research studies focused on the development of social-emotional skills through SEL interventions. They found that students who participated in SEL programs had increased social-emotional skills by 22 percentile points over those who did not participate in SEL programs. Similarly, students who participated in SEL programs had increased positive attitudes, pro-social behaviors, and academic achievement compared with those who did not participate. In other words, when classrooms take the time to focus on SEL, students improve academic performance. Excuse me, let me add the graphics here. It might help. Similarly, they found that students who participated in SEL had decreased conduct problems and decreased emotional distress compared with those who did not participate. Overall, these findings are consistent across school locations, urban, suburban, or rural, as well as age bands, elementary, middle, or high. These findings were given stronger classroom, these findings were strong in classrooms where teachers also implemented programs that were intended. So that's an important fact to remember as well. There are multiple ways to implement SEL. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this section of our webinar here today, these are SEL programs. And SEL programs can be implemented in schools or after school. These programs can be focused on targeted skills that integrate SEL, or they can be focused on the integration of SEL with academic content, or they can promote teaching practices that develop safe and supportive classrooms. Although SEL programs are important, they are not necessarily the only way to promote SEL. There are things that educators are doing already to integrate SEL specifically. There are general pedagogical practices that promote SEL that can be connected to teacher work in schools. So as we move forward near the end of this talk, I have another polling question for you. And we're going to do this one a little bit differently. We don't have multiple choices, but it's more open-ended, and I see that we have a few more folks that have joined us here. The question is, what are ways you support a positive school climate and implement SEL in your schools and districts? And you can respond here by going to the right-hand side of your screen. There should be a menu bar that says, at the very bottom, it says Chat. And in the little field, or the little box below, you can type in your response to this question. We'll wait a few seconds for folks to provide an answer to this. Jill, did we get any responses on this question?
We haven't gotten any yet, no.
Okay. That's okay. Well, within this question, this is a fairly loaded question to ask, but I think it's an important question to ask in the context of this conversation that we're having today. So I understand if folks aren't willing to share the ways that they can implement or provide implementations of some kind that support school climate and implement SEL within their schools, their districts. And this could be a program, a formally designed program, an evidence-based program. It could be a locally designed program within their school. It could be specific strategies. It could be entire initiatives. Well, we're going to get into some of these details in just a bit with Nick, but before we go any further with this, I'm just going to, there we go, thanks, Jill. One other slide here I want to touch base on before we move forward. In our approach to school climate and SEL, we see social and emotional competencies as the rungs that hold school climate and academic standards together. We believe this because school climate focuses on the overarching structures and conditions necessary for successful teaching and learning, whereas SEL focuses on the process for skill development. We also believe this because you add value where there is a joint focus on the conditions necessary for learning and student skill development, meaning a combination of academics, climate, and SEL, given that school climate and SEL promote and enhance one another. We also believe this because integrating school climate and SEL efforts further supports multiple efforts, including bullying prevention, school safety, positive behavior supports, and mental health. Also, when you define school climate, a school climate initiative with a focus on SEL, you can begin continuous improvement efforts where you can start to define what your efforts, you can find the focus of your efforts. Go ahead and click to the next slide for us. Thanks, Jill. So as we move forward into this webinar, now that we've covered SEL and school climate, and we have a better understanding of what those are and how they're related to each other and how AIR has conceptualized their relationship based on years of research, we're now going to move into AIR school climate and SEL implementation path. And Nick's going to walk us through each of the phases or each of the stages of this path and unpack them quite thoroughly for you, so you have a better understanding of that. So this goes back to the question I asked earlier, how do you support social emotional learning and school climate? We're going to provide strategies, large-scale strategies for accomplishing this. Nick?
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate the overview of SEL and school climate. So as Mark mentioned, we strongly believe that school climate and SEL have a strong connection with one another and really help kind of build that foundation for academic success. And really, when we combine all three, we're really building a ladder for student success. And in order to combine school climate and SEL efforts, we did create a coordinated and purposeful approach through our implementation path. And as you can see, we have 6 steps or components of the path. And our approach really focuses on a cycle of continuous improvement and the use of data to make informed decisions about implementation of efforts and how these efforts impact your school community and your students. Although the centerpiece is using data that are not always used, such as student perceptions of school climate, maybe teacher perceptions of school climate, and student social and emotional skills, although these pieces of data aren't typically used to make informed decisions, it is important to be purposeful and coordinated in your efforts, developing strategic plans about how your effort will unfold. However, it's also about engaging your stakeholders, obtaining their input, and supporting them and coaching them along the way. So it really is trying to be purposeful in your path. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to review this path in more depth and discuss some of the potential strategies to use to implement them. And then I'm also going to provide, along the way, some example tools that others have used throughout the process. So to start, we're going to do a polling question for you all. And the polling question asks you about what component of the implementation path would you like to learn more about? Well, I'm going to go over each path. I'm really curious to see if there's one aspect that you want me to spend a little bit more time on, and just to make sure that I am really clear and pithy in how I'm describing it. So go ahead. What part of the path would you like to learn more about? Planning for SEL and school climate initiatives, engaging stakeholders in SEL and school climate visioning, conducting SEL and the climate data inventory, providing ongoing SEL climate coaching and supports, or assessing the SEL and climate effort. Which one would you really like to hear a little bit more about? So just take a minute and go ahead and vote. And there's actually one that we left off in that, which is to prepare for and implement SEL climate practices and programs. So sorry about that. We did leave one off the polling question. So Jill, do we have some? Great. So it looks like we are across the board. So at least one person or a couple people want to learn a little bit about each piece. So I'll try and be as clear about each piece as possible. And if you have additional questions or concerns along the way, please use the chat feature, and Jill will let me know as we go forward. So the first, sorry, technical, do I have control, Jill? All right, great, thank you so much, sorry about that. So the first part of the implementation path is planning for your SEL and your school climate initiative. And this is where you're really wanting to lay out your foundation for your initiative. And I think it's important to, when we're talking about this path, it's also important to recognize that you are probably already doing something in your school or your district that does focus on climate or does focus on student social and emotional skills. So the goal of this path is not to say that you need to start over or you need to start somewhere new, but it really is to try and create that coordinated and purposeful approach in how you're overseeing these initiatives and really combining them to really develop a positive school climate and student social and emotional skills. So some of the things that are really important in this stage is you want to develop a core team that oversees the SEL and climate effort. As I mentioned before, that you're probably there's probably things in your school or your district that are happening around these efforts. However, many times people aren't aware of what other people are doing. And so it's really important to develop a core team that's overseeing this initiative and really understands the process and understand what's happening in the school or what's happening in the district around these sorts of efforts so things are coordinated. So you might have, for example, a PBIS effort and an MTSS effort and maybe a school climate effort, which all in some components relate to creating a positive school climate and really focusing on SEL skills. So it's important then to kind of keep these efforts coordinated and organized and having a core team that really oversees how all these efforts are being coordinated amongst one another. Another thing is you really want to conduct a readiness assessment, determine your organizational capacity. And the tool that I'm going to share with you all, it provides some components of the organization or your readiness that you want to look at. For example, you need to see if you have the necessary skills of your staff, like how much training do you need and professional learning do you need to provide. Do you have support from your key leaders is really important in order to get these things off of the ground. So having your superintendent or your principal really buy into these processes and helping them understand why school climate's really important and the urgency of creating a systematic school climate approach is extremely important. And another thing that you all need to do is develop plans to implement the initiative. So as I mentioned before, there's lots of things that are typically happening in schools, but you need to be purposeful in that, and you need to think through how are these things really coming together. So for example, you might want to think about how are you engaging your stakeholders around this. Do you have a purposeful communication and learning opportunity? Do you want to collect and analyze data? How are you going to disseminate that information? How are you going to implement the initiatives that you start based on your data? And how are you going to start sustaining these efforts so that they become a part of your school climate and your school culture to engage in improving your climate and students' social and emotional skills? So it really is being strategic about the remaining components of the process when you're thinking about your planning. Sorry, I'm having a little technical issue.
You should be able to move your mouse, Nick, and click on the slide.
Yeah, I am, and it's not moved. There we go. Huh, that was weird. Sorry about that again. So this is an example readiness assessment. So the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Resources developed a Show Me Am I Ready scale, and it provides a way to determine if you're ready to implement a new intervention. So this tool is not specific to school climate or SEL, but it does help you reflect on whether or not you're ready to implement an intervention across multiple domains. So similarly, like what I was just talking about, it provides you about 6 overarching components with multiple questions underneath to determine how ready are you to implement an intervention or initiative in your school. So for example, this one, it's really about, it asks you questions about the level of support that you have from those impacted. So have you communicated with your teachers and with your students and with your members of the remainder of your school community about these efforts? And are they aware that they're going to happen? And are they supportive of that they're going to happen? So really getting their buy-in and input, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next phase. But that's really important to determine whether or not you're ready. You need to determine if you have the level of support politically. So are your key leaders engaged? Do you have support from your community members? And do you have engaged partners to help you? So while you can, it's not necessarily extremely costly to implement this entire process, when you're implementing certain interventions, it can become costly, or it can increase, it can be difficult to do without engaging external partners and community resources, for example, to really help improve the school climate and the student social and emotional skills, and making sure you have the financial and human resources ready to go to support these efforts. So then the second component is the engaging stakeholders and the SEL and climate visioning. And this is really where it's important to get the buy-in from your stakeholders and really using the plan that you developed previously to think through how are you actually going to get them to support you and help implement everything that you want to do for your school climate and your approach. So for example, you might want to bring together a group of key stakeholders and develop a shared SEL and school climate vision and mission. So you really want to bring them together to see what do you want it to look like. So Mark did a nice job summarizing some various components of school climate and social emotional learning, but you might want to modify that or adapt that for your specific context and really thinking through what does a good school climate mean for you? What are the skills and abilities and knowledge and behaviors that you want your students to have in order to be successful in school and in life? And then with that, you also want to develop a logic model to help organize your work. So you want to think about, all right, so what resources do we have? What can we use to implement the program? What is that going to then look like in terms of specific actions that are going to happen? What are we actually going to do? And then ultimately, what outcome do we want to have? So again, your logic model should really be connected to your SEL school climate and vision and mission. And then, as I was mentioning before, between the connections between the various approaches between SEL and school climate that you have, but you also want to connect them to other existing initiatives, such as your educator effectiveness initiative or your academic standards, and really think about how do I embed social and emotional learning and climate into things that I'm already doing. Because, like I said before, you're probably already doing a lot, and you just want to make sure that you're being systematic in how you're developing your school climate and your student social and emotional skills. So the tool that I want to provide here is, as I mentioned, that you need to be kind of coordinated in your approach and your communications to your stakeholders. And in order to do that, you need to be very purposeful in how you engage them in the efforts. And to do that, you really need to have a clear purpose for why they should engage and how are they going to benefit. Because you know that school climate and SEL is important, but do they know that it's important? And how are you going to really sell the initiative to them to determine that it's important? So you want to be strategic in your communication strategies and the messaging that you're going to give. So for example, teachers, why is this initiative important for teachers? It's going to help improve their capacity to develop more engaged and skilled youth. So why might it be more important for families? They're going to experience more engaging and welcoming classrooms. For students, they're going to develop the skills that will help them be successful in school and life. So you're going to want to target your messaging specifically towards the stakeholder group that you're referring to get them in and to let them know that you really value their input and really value their needs and their concerns within the process, because the process is extremely important in order to improve your SEL and school climate. So you definitely want to do some practice what you preach, I guess, and really model these behaviors of creating an inclusive classroom in schools by really engaging and making it purposeful for them. The third component then is the conduct SEL and school climate data inventory. And this can be a challenge because school climate and SEL data can seem very mysterious at times and unsure of what it means and what it looks like. So you really want to make sure you're very purposeful in your approach on what data you are going to collect and collecting multiple pieces of data. So for example, some folks just look at observation data when they're trying to assess the classroom or their school climate and culture. However, there's other things that you can do as well. You can get your stakeholder perceptions of school climate, so doing a school climate inventory of your teachers and your students and your non-instructional staff and your families, and really gauging how they all feel about their school climate is extremely important because it really lets you know how they are experiencing the climate of the school, which is then going to impact such things as their absenteeism or teacher retention, because school climate is a key predictor, and student social emotional is a key predictor of wanting to be and engaged in schools. So really kind of looking at how people are experiencing it themselves. You might also want to look at student social and emotional skills and how how student social and emotional skills are working to see where you might need to target some programs or interventions, but also to see what social and emotional skills are working well in your school and what do they have. And this can be done through student self-report. It can be done through teacher reports. It can be done through more performance assessments where kids are really engaging in communication strategies or self-regulation strategies where you really see them enact these skills in the classroom. Or you might want to look at other things like disciplinary infractions. So there's lots of pieces of data that you can use to collect for your school climate and SEL data, and you just want to make sure that you're being very purposeful in the types of data that you're collecting. And then particularly if you're engaging in stakeholder perceptions or having students or teachers report on student social and emotional skills, you want to make sure that you're very clear about why you're collecting this data and be very purposeful and provide guidance on the data collection expectations, because when individuals know why you're collecting data, how you're going to collect data, and why you're using data, they're more likely to, one, take the survey or engage in the data collection process, and then two, be more honest and truthful and be very mindful in how they're approaching it, because they know that their voice is going to be heard, and this is a good way to use it. So just making sure that you're very clear on that is important. One way to do that is not just setting up the expectations, but how you provide data-friendly reports and making sure that others can review the data in a particular way. And then one of the things that we really promote is a data retreat to review the data, determine findings. And so this just isn't having your data folks present on your data, but really having your stakeholders come together. And we've had, when we've done this, we've had students come together at the table, families, parents, community members, teachers, having a whole host of folks come and really review the data to determine what is it saying, and kind of think through what are the key findings that we have, and then know what's working and what needs to improve to be very strategic in the programs and practices that you're going to implement in the future. So the one example that I want to, there we go, sorry. The one example I want to show from here is from the Safe and Supportive School grantee, or the S3 grantee. This is where 11 states really supported districts in developing school climate assessments and surveys, and using that data to then be very strategic in their actions. And so what this provides you is kind of a way to disaggregate your data. So what it does is it has you look through the different components on the far left, so your engagement or your safety related needs are two of the dimensions that Mark mentioned of school climate. And then looking through at what are the needs of the various groups in your community. So really looking at seeing if there's differences by subgroups of students, so by race, or by class or LGBT status. Just really thinking through, do different groups of students or families perceive the environment to be different along these domains? And are these differences school-wide, or are they or district-wide by grade or whatnot? So really thinking through how are the needs different for your different groups of students, and how are they perceiving things differently? So we're going to go to our next polling question, as I've been talking for a few minutes, and so I'm sure you could use a break from my voice. So I really am curious to see how you all use your school climate and SEL data. And we have multiple options for that. So for accountability reasons, to help students reflect, to provide students opportunities to be active members of the school community, to improve your own practice. Jill, can you put up the polling question for them, please?
Actually, we're going to have them respond in the question section, if we could, again, the way they've done before. I'm sorry about that. But if they could put some of these uses, and I'll let you know what they put in there, that would be great.
Oh, okay. We don't have a multiple choice for this one?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, so go ahead and type in how you use data, and since you're typing in, if you have other ways that you've used data, that would also be fantastic to learn about, because I'm always interested to hear how educators are using their data to improve their school climate and social emotional learning skills.
We've got one of them is to improve their own practice. That one was mentioned.
Great, yeah. I mean, I think that's really key, is to really think through. So even if you don't have a school or district-wide system of collecting data, being very mindful on how, what are some of the more formative assessments that you can use in your classroom to really gauge. I know I used I taught first grade, and in my first grade classroom, I had my students self-reflect often on their work samples, and so they would always, in their folder every week, they would put in their favorite piece, what they thought they worked the hardest on and did the best in, and they would kind of grade themselves on why they did a good job and how then they could improve that. So using that data then helped me think about, okay, what are my students really concerned about right now, then to order and improve my instruction and making sure I'm being very targeted and strategic in how.
We also had a mention of getting parents and staff buy-in.
Oh, that's a great one, getting parents and staff buy-in. I really like, yeah, that's a great one that we should have added. And that goes back to that planning and engagement piece, is to really think through when people see their own data and the data of their students, whether it be parents or teachers, they're definitely more likely to get into that, to buy into the process and really understand and think through what does that data mean, what does it mean for me and my students, and then moving forward. So yeah, I really like that one, and I'm surprised I didn't put it in there, but so thank you for that one. All right, great. I'm going to keep moving to the last three. I'm going to try and get these done in the next 8 or so minutes. So then if you guys have any questions for Mark or myself, you're definitely welcome to ask those. Do I have control again?
Yes. Go ahead.
There we go. All right, so the next thing is to prepare for and implement your SEL and climate practices. So you just did your data inventory in the previous section, and what you want to do is you want to use that data then to really start thinking through about what are the programs and practices that you need. And when you're reviewing your data and identifying those programs and practices, there's a couple things to keep in mind. It's one, you want to look at what are those things that you definitely need to improve upon based on your data inventory. But you also want to think about those things that you're doing well, because you can really leverage your skills and your strengths and the assets that you and your staff have to really then kind of move yourself forward and help implement those programs and practices that you need to implement for the needs that you have. And so being very strategic about both your assets and the things that you need to improve, I think, is really important, and something that people don't always necessarily think through about how they can leverage their strengths to then implement new things, new policies and practices. So what you want to do is you definitely want to identify those practices that you're currently implementing, because as I mentioned before, you're probably doing some of these things, and how they align to your data inventory, your needs, and your strengths. But then looking through other programs and practices that you may need to implement in case you don't have a program or practice that targets your specific needs. So kind of reviewing those programs and practices and determining if you need to add anything, need to get anything out, because you might have some redundant practices in there that aren't necessarily coordinated with one another, so you might need to get some out. Or if you need to modify or adapt your current practices that you have in order to move you and your students forward. So once you implement them, you should be enacting quick cycles of improvement to determine your implementation. So being mindful of how your educators are implementing these programs and practices, and making adjustments based on the continuous monitoring and continuous cycles of improvement. Because you have an intervention or practice or program that's been research-based that you want to integrate, you always want to make sure that's fitting your context and determining if there's anything that needs to be modified or adapted to really meet the needs of your students. So enacting those quick cycles. And that also helps educators improve on their implementation of practices because they're being very reflective on their implementation and getting feedback on their implementation, so making sure that that cycle is continuously going. And again, you always want to be continuously engaging your stakeholders. As the one person who put the comment in about using data to get buy-in from stakeholders, it's the same thing when you're implementing programs and practices. You want to continue that engagement and that buy-in and the momentum that you have around these programs and practices to continue implementing and continue support from your stakeholders, and in getting their support whenever you need it as well. So the sample that I want to show you, sorry, I'm not sure why it's not. There we go. Oops. And then I went too far. Sorry about that, folks. So what I wanted to show you was the Hexagon tool from the National Implementation Research Network. And what they do is it's similar to a readiness assessment slightly, but really a little bit more purposeful to determine whether or not you're ready to implement a specific practice. And I do want to mention that just because we're showing these examples, by no means does this necessarily mean that we endorse any of the tools, nor does it necessarily mean that they endorse, the various organizations endorse us. They're just examples that we've seen and we've used before in various schools and districts around these topics, and it would be good examples to share with you all. But the Hexagon tool specifically is really about helping you think through whether an intervention is right for you and your school or district. And they're very similar in kind of the things that I've been talking about before. One, does it fit your need? So based on data, does it fit what you necessarily need to do? Does it fit your local context? So do you have, does it really kind of help you with your populations of interest? Does it necessarily, does it have evidence that really relates that it works with your intended need and whatnot? Do you have the necessary resources to implement, whether that's financial support from key leadership or whatnot? Is it evidence-based? So this is also really extremely important to focus on. Do you have enough? Is there enough evidence that this program or practice works with your population of interest? Are you ready to use it? So a lot of those questions that we talked about before. And then do you have the capacity to do it? So do you have the human capacity to do it? Do you have enough people to do it? Do they have the skill to do it? So really trying to think through these 6 components to determine whether or not you are ready to implement a program or practice that you've identified. The next is providing ongoing SEL and climate coaching and support. And this is really important to do to, and how it relates to those quick cycles of implementation that we were just talking about. But it really is helping educators think through, are they implementing the program or practice as intended? And this is extremely important, as Mark mentioned, that the more that you implement practices, particularly social-emotional learning practices as they're intended, the better effects that they have on use. So if a program asks you to implement a lesson twice a week, it's better to implement it twice a week and be targeted in what you're doing, and being very purposeful in the use of the programs. That's what's shown in the research to have effects. And so ways to support the implementation is you can do observations with corresponding feedback loops. So making sure that you're in the classroom observing, seeing if educators are implementing the practices as intended, helping the educator think through their implementation of that practice. This can be done through also peer coaching, having peers go into each other's classrooms and checking on each other's work. And then a self-reflection tool would also be good. Are they being mindful of their own social emotional competencies? Are they being mindful about their own approaches and implementation to the work? And then continued professional learning opportunities. So if there's a particular aspect of the intervention that doesn't make sense or might not necessarily meet your needs, so maybe you're implementing a social emotional learning program but doesn't have a component on bullying, but that's really important for you, making sure that you are having those continued professional learning opportunities around these various topics. And with that, you definitely want to continue to develop the necessary infrastructure to sustain your SEL and school climate practices. So that would mean such things as making sure you continue to have the necessary resources, the policies and practices in place to have professional learning opportunities, a schedule laid out, and may attach it to your induction programs so people know that SEL and school climate are extremely important to you. The tool that I want to show is from the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders. It's a teacher SEL self-assessment tool. And what this tool does is it helps teachers self-reflect on teaching practices that promote SEL. So the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders identified 10 teaching practices that promote social and emotional learning and academic instruction. And so what this tool does is it helps teachers reflect on those 10 practices, how well they're implementing it and how often they're implementing it. What's really nice about this tool as well is it also helps them self-assess on their own social and emotional competencies. So their own self-awareness, their own self-regulation, their own relationship skills, and how those social and emotional skills impact their implementation of those teaching practices. So it really helps them think through both how are they interacting with students and the practices that they're implementing, as well as kind of their own emotional sense of well-being and that impact on students on their practice. The final component in the cycle before you start all over again is collecting that process data, is assessing your efforts. And this is important to do both. You want to assess how well you're implementing things. So again, going back to those quick cycles, you want to be purposeful in thinking through how well are we implementing our efforts, how well are we implementing the interventions as intended, because that kind of data is really going to help you unpack what's working and what's not working in your school and what do you need to modify in order to have the intended impact that you want. And so you also want to do outcomes data to determine your impact. So we're looking at those outcomes that you want and determining whether or not your efforts have this impact. So some people ask what's the difference between the assess SEL and climate efforts versus the data inventory. It depends upon where you're at in the process. Sometimes they're the same thing and sometimes they're different. This part is really assessing your overall effort to help you, again, plan the next cycle of improvement. So really using that process and outcome data at the beginning of that next cycle of improvement process. And again, you want to routinize these structures to really create a positive school climate and develop student social and emotional skills. The tool that I wanted to share with you real quickly is from the Maryland Safe and Supportive Schools. I shared another tool from the S3 grantee program, this one specifically from Maryland. And what they do is they had a visitor log. And what they did is when their coaches, they had school climate coaches go out to schools, and they wanted to determine the amount of effort that was going into something and the outcome of that effort. So they have the percentage of time, so how much effort was being put in to the coaching activity, and then what kinds of activities were happening to determine if their efforts were having the anticipated outcome. So they reviewed these visitor logs to determine how well, what coaches were doing in the schools, in the districts, and how much effort that cost. So that is our implementation path. Mark and I are more than happy to answer any questions that you might have about the path per se, or any of the tools and resources that we shared or researched. So as Jill mentioned, you can either raise your hand and she can unmute you to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat feature. Mark and I completely clear on everything that we mentioned.
We got a thank you from one of the participants.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, if we don't have any questions, we do want to let you know that the next webinar is November 1st in the series, which is on professional learning communities, 6 core attributes for building a sustainable model of high-quality professional learning. So watch your email for the registration invite. And we would like to mention that we have the references here for you of any of the tools and research that Mark and I mentioned throughout our presentation. And finally, we have our contact information if you have any questions or concerns about your school climate or SEL approach. So again, thank you very much for listening and participating in our webinar on school climate and social and emotional learning. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, everyone.